Welcome to this special episode of the Green Left News podcast. The usual show is on break, so we've recorded these special interviews ahead of time to tide you over until 2025. If you'd like to support the show, you can head to greenleft.org.au/support to become a supporter from only $5 a month, and you can find out more information about plans at that website. Also, I'd like to acknowledge that this podcast was recorded on stolen land that was never ceded and always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And Green Left stands with First Nations people in campaigns for justice, land rights and sovereignty. So we hope you enjoy this interview today, and we'll be back in 2025 with more news, updates and analysis. Enjoy the podcast. So welcome to the podcast. This episode we're going to be joined by Ben Radford, who's a Green Left journalist and is a former host of this podcast, who has been travelling in Latin America for the past year or so. Ben's been closely following a lot of the political developments in Latin America, including interviewing a lot of activists on the ground. So today we're going to have a bit of a broad chat and catch up with Ben about what he's learnt from these discussions and this trip, and experiencing all the huge political developments of the past year from a very different perspective in a different part of the world. So welcome back to the podcast, Ben.
Thanks, Isaac. Thanks for having me.
So I guess just to start off, could you give a bit of a rundown of where you've been in the past few months, what places you visited?
In the past few months, most of my time I've been in Ecuador, and at the moment I'm in Peru. So yeah, I've had a chance to, when I was in Ecuador, to meet a few people, make some contacts, and I used to go to a rally in Cuenca, which is a city in southern Ecuador. And because Ecuador is currently going through a huge electricity crisis, there's been a lot of protests, but then also against the government's mismanagement of it. I guess we can talk a little bit about it later. But at the moment, Ecuador has recently, from last year, has had a very right-wing government who has been pushing very hard to implement what they call a state of emergency, but it has essentially suspended the constitutional rights of people, of citizens, and granted the police and the armed forces sort of this unprecedented power to do things like search people's houses without warrants, essentially gives them a lot of protections from culpability for any human rights violations that they commit. So that's sort of the scenario at the moment in Ecuador, which I can go into a little bit more detail later.
Well, yeah, why don't we start with that? So obviously you could go into that a bit more, but first I just wanted to hear about like the protest that you went to. What was the kind of atmosphere like? What were the kind of the demands like?
Yeah, so the protest was coincided with what's called the Ibero-American Summit, which was being held in Cuenca in mid-November. And essentially this summit is a yearly meeting of different government leaders and representatives from different Spanish and Portuguese-speaking countries. And so it's held in a different city in a different country every year. And it's basically where, all these heads of state and even the, King of Spain, they basically get together and essentially decide how to keep screwing the working class. They make trade agreements between countries and all this stuff. And so it was, in this context that they decide a bunch of different grassroots organizations, environmental groups, indigenous groups, got together and decided to stage a counter summit. And so that was held over 3 days, from the 13th to the 15th of November. And the first day was basically like a big public forum of, I guess, setting the mandate, setting the agenda of what these 3 days was going to be. And then on the second day, they had a big march through the city. And so this march brought together, I think it was more than 70 different organizations or representatives from different organizations, like indigenous groups, anti-mining groups, trade unions. There was a big student contingent. And so they all gathered in the city and met in this one spot, which was the drivers' union of Cuenca. their headquarters. Sort of congregated there, had an ancestral smoking ceremony, and then from there they marched through the city towards the venue where they were holding this Ibero-American summit. And so I was, had a chat to a few people during the protest from different organizations, and they basically have been organizing protests for a while around similar themes of a big one is mining. At the moment in Ecuador, there's a lot of the countries being opened up for mining, or has been historically, and even more so with the Daniel Noboa government. And a lot of these mining concessions are controlled by foreign companies, and particularly Australian companies actually have. Talking to one of the guys at the protest, and I told him, I was from Australia reporting for Australian grassroots media, and he said, "Oh well, funny you're from Australia because Australian mining companies control 30% of the mining concessions in Ecuador."
Oh wow!
And so he was drawing this link between mining and the current water crisis that they're having at the moment. Ecuador's been having, in some parts, energy blackouts of up to 14 hours a day. And that's basically because the country is totally reliant, or almost totally reliant, on hydroelectric power. And because they're going through this unprecedented drought, a lot of their dam levels are really low. And so they're essentially having to ration electricity at the moment. But then there's a connection with all this mining throughout the country, which obviously uses huge amounts of water, redirected from water that would be either going to these dams or going towards the drinking water supply. So they have a huge role to play in the current levels of drought, which the government, again, has taken very little steps to essentially reduce their dependence on hydroelectric power. I think it's more than 80% of the country's electricity is generated from these hydroelectric plants.
Yeah, wow.
And so, I guess back to the protest, they walked through the streets and essentially came to the point where across the river from where the summit was being held, and sort of chanted, had not quite a confrontation with police, but there was sort of rows and rows of police behind this huge metal barricade, essentially blocking any entrance towards the summit.
Into the summit, yeah.
So that was a representative I spoke to from what's called the National Anti-Mining Front, and they have, I guess, organizations all around the country sort of resisting mining in their own territories, and essentially, I guess, the plundering of their country by these transnational companies who essentially arrive, a lot of the time don't even employ local people. They sort of bring their own labor, or if they do it, it's very temporary. Exploit all of this massive wealth for not a lot of money, and then all of this wealth essentially gets transported overseas, and then obviously leaves behind these huge, swathes of environmental destruction where the water's been depleted, the groundwater's been contaminated, the land's been contaminated, and then, with very little or no benefits for any of these communities in terms of any sort of investment in infrastructure or things like that. Another guy I spoke to at the protest actually told me that he said 95% of all of the wealth and the I guess exploitation production it disappears, like it goes outside the country. So I guess that gives you an idea of the situation in Ecuador at the moment.
Yeah, and like you said, it's like having this immediate impact of obviously not only the environmental destruction, in a kind of general sense, but impacting their water levels. So there's like electricity blackouts and things. And I know like we had a few catch-ups and meetings lined up where you had to kind of drop out because it's like, oh, well, actually there's no electricity at the moment, so it's going to be hard to hook in or whatever. And I guess the fact that it's 30% of these mining companies are Australian, or 30% of this mining is controlled by Australian companies, shows that there's opportunities for probably some opportunities for solidarity protests or some kind of actions we can do here, because Australian companies are the ones who are perpetrating a lot of this, environmental destruction and things like that. So it's really interesting to hear about that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I couldn't help making the comparison between when I was in Cuba, who, where they're going through their own uh, energy crisis and have been for quite a long time in terms of having to ration electricity use, and a big part of that is due to the US blockade, where they essentially can't get their hands on enough fuel and the spare parts and everything to repair and like upkeep and maintain their power plants. Um, and I guess maybe in Cuba, because you've got, I guess, a government who's, I guess, trying to reduce hardship for a lot of people, that it's sort of set up to, I guess, make people's daily lives a little bit easier given the circumstances. So, in Cuba, you can ring a hotline, government hotline, and say, oh, look, what are the schedules for power outages? When is the power coming back on? And I guess the most recent energy crisis they had, where they suffered blackouts essentially throughout the entire country, when one of the biggest or most important power plants failed, and how they sort of instantly worked to restore power as quickly as they could within a few days. Whereas in Ecuador, it's just the hours for the blackouts, they would change. Sort of, they would publish one schedule, like the government energy company for a certain area would publish a schedule, and then 2 days later they would completely change the schedule, essentially with no warning. So, you had all these people that couldn't really plan anything beyond a day or two, because the hours would change from, maybe 10 a.m. till 3 p.m. without power. It would completely switch with no warning.
Yeah, wow.
And, I think a lot of people are seeing it, particularly with, the government they've got at the moment, Noboa. Him and his family basically have huge interests, or like investments and control of energy companies. And at the moment, Ecuador's energy system is state-owned. It's one of the few countries in Latin America that their energy system is still state-owned. And as a result, it means that their electricity prices are some of the lowest in Latin America. And I guess what some people are accusing him of is essentially letting this entire system run into the ground to then justify privatizing it and making an absolute killing off it, or him and his family and all of the interest that he has in all these energy companies. So it's when you privatize something that basically guarantees huge profits, all these private interests. So that's one aspect of it, because basically since the energy crisis started in November, he's basically done nothing. He's announced no sort of plans to abate the crisis or find any sort of alternatives. He's basically just hidden in the presidential palace. Hasn't even, a lot of time, doesn't even front up to the press, just sort of sends out his energy minister or whatever minister. So yeah, I guess there's that comparison to be made between, the two different governments and how they're handling the, the energy crisis respectively in their countries.
Yeah, and as you said, it's both having these energy crises that are, at least partially, well, obviously a huge part of the Cuban energy crisis is the US blockade is probably the main driver of it. But yeah, and as we just mentioned, the role of Australian companies, and I'm sure there's a lot of other countries who have, part of the mining in Ecuador as well, but have these, foreign interference in their energy that is causing crises, but they're reacting in very different ways. And yeah, people should listen to. We did do a podcast a few months back about your experiences in Cuba, which was really insightful. So people should check that out. I just also wanted to go over to, you obviously spent a lot of time in Peru, as you said, and there's been you've been reporting on some of the huge strikes that have been going on over there, with more than 1 million workers going on strike. I think there's been at least 2 massive strike days of action. So could you tell us, what are these strikes about, and who's taking part? There's more than 1 million people, so it must be a fairly broad spectrum of society taking part.
Yeah, so there's been a couple of big strikes in basically as many months in Peru, and it started off as strikes mostly from the transport sector. So taxi drivers, bus drivers, all these workers in the transport industry, and mostly on the coast. So initially started focused in Lima, the capital, and Callao, which is sort of like a northern a city a little bit north of Lima, and Trujillo, which is a city further up the coast. And they were basically striking in the face of a huge level of extortion and violence that they're facing as workers, and mostly at the hands of organized criminal groups who basically uh, impose what they call protection fees on these drivers and on the like transport companies, where they have to pay like daily fees, extortion fees, and if they don't, then they're threatened. Um, their cars or buses or offices can be burnt, and then even a lot of taxi drivers have been killed. Dozens have been killed in the last months for essentially failing to pay these extortion fees. And so, yeah, the strike was based around this, essentially taking strike, protesting against the level of government inaction, because basically government hasn't taken to protect these workers. In fact, what they've done is go the other way, and they've continued passing these laws that essentially favour organised criminal groups, and at the same time keep further criminalising the right to protest and the right to strike. And because in Peru, Peru's Congress, which is where all the laws get passed or rejected, it's basically controlled by this big alliance of right wing and far right groups. So they've progressively over the last few years kept approving these sort of super conservative, super sort of anti-worker laws. And one of the laws essentially makes it harder to investigate organized crime. For example, they modified the criminal code, Peru's criminal code, to essentially modify the definition of what constitutes organized crime. Things like extortion, human and organ trafficking, illegal logging, basically that now doesn't fit inside the definition of what constitutes organized crime.
Right.
So yeah, it's all sort of in legal terms. There's a lot to dig into, but essentially it basically facilitates organized crime. Things like corruption is no longer considered, and so basically more than half of Congress people at the moment in Peru are being investigated for corruption. So, it's no surprise that they're basically passing laws that make it harder for them to be investigated or to be convicted for corruption. And then on the other side, I guess to further try and criminalize protests, they passed what's called an urban terrorism law, which basically, it's supposed to be this like tough on crime law, which imposes longer prison sentences for things like extortion and kidnapping and whatnot. But it's this really open, sort of murky definition of what urban terrorism is. And, it's basically raised all these big alarms of that could basically be used to essentially just prosecute protesters, people going on strike, criminalize the right to process, which is, not, it's also unsurprising because a lot of politicians, a lot of the sort of corporate media, they will directly label protesters as terrorists. It's a very common tactic, being like, oh, they just want to, cause destruction in the streets and they're a threat to democracy and whatever. I guess the same smears that are used against protesters all over the world. And so, yeah, but the thing was, after this transport strike, basically it spread to different industries. because it's not just transport workers that are being affected by this really widespread extortion, violence. There's workers in the textile industry, workers in the mining industry, as well as a bunch of sort of small business owners. And then, sort of, I guess, Indigenous groups are still under attack. Student rights are still under attack, human rights organizations. So they sort of formed under this national strike that took place, and it spread way beyond the transport sector. And it was essentially had similar demands, I guess, beyond just extortion, but also it's a very common call in Peru at protests of, in Spanish, que se vayan todos, which is basically like all of them should go, or get rid of all of them. And they're referring to Congress because, it's this just well of corruption and anti-people and anti-worker laws and practices. And what the most recent strike also coincided with the APEC summit in Lima, which is sort of one of those big summits of government leaders and representatives where they come together and do deals and try and essentially keep guaranteeing profit for the elite class and for the capitalist class. So that became like normally the protests will march to Congress, protest out there, but for the most recent one they marched to the venue in Lima where it was being held, the protest outside that. And were basically met with police brutality, as most of the protests are. The government always deploys, I think for the most recent one, it was 10,000 police and 4,000 soldiers
Crazy.
across the country who essentially police these protests, which is more than double the amount that they've deployed across the country to supposedly combat organized crime and violence in the streets and stuff. So, that really shows where the priorities are. Not that having more police in the streets makes the streets any safer, but still. And yeah, I mean, there's lots of examples of really, really sort of horrific police brutality. Them just sort of launching rubber bullets, firing rubber bullets directly at protesters' bodies. There's lots of head wounds, lots of sort of abdominal wounds. They'll often, because they really didn't want a sort of national embarrassment of protesters disrupting or reaching the APEC summit, because it's obviously like, the eyes of the world are on Peru. They were particularly brutal in sort of fencing off or cordoning off the whole area around the summit. And that included sort of trying to kettle protesters down certain streets, sort of advancing in big lines with their shields and just knocking people back and continually pushing people back until so they couldn't get any further. But yeah, I mean, that basically happens for most of the big protests and strikes. Police have a lot of impunity to sort of mete out violence, and that's and even more recently, like in the last week or so, Congress basically passed another law that makes it even harder to investigate cases of police violence. And yeah, I guess that gives you a a sort of picture of this increasingly authoritarian government in Peru, particularly since Pedro Castillo was ousted at the end of not December last year, but the year before. We've seen an increasingly right-wing authoritarian slide in the Peruvian government. Basically got this Congress that has unchecked power to pass all of these laws that favor themselves, favor the elite class, at the cost of the working class. But at the same time, there's been, as you said, there was about a million workers that went on strike across the country, which is, that's a significant number.
Huge.
And, despite the violence, despite the repression, people are still hitting the streets, and not just in Lima. That's where the biggest numbers are, but all across the country. they often resort to tactics like blockading roads, and peacefully marching. But a lot of the time, again, as I said, they're met with a lot of violence, particularly in Peru's inland regions, has the highest numbers of um, indigenous people. There's a lot of inequality between the coast and inland, uh, mostly poorer communities in the inland. So again, it's even harder for them to seek justice. They're basically suffer violence at the hands of the police.
Yeah, it's interesting as well. I just thought I'd mention for people who don't know, like the population of Peru is about 34, 35 million. So it's not that much bigger than Australia's population. And if you could imagine a million people on strike in Australia, it would be absolutely insane. So it's like a huge chunk of the population. And I guess to look at it in a positive light, like, the Castillo, Pedro Castillo got in on the backs of the kind of support of, indigenous people and workers. So, there's the chance that these kind of popular mobilizations and huge strikes are the basis for where, this corrupt government can be changed, and some of this, all this terrible stuff you just reported can be addressed in some way, hopefully. I also just wanted to mention with the police brutality aspect, like, obviously we don't experience anything like that extreme level here in Australia with protests, though we have started to see like little tidbits of that. I don't know if you saw the Disrupt Land Forces protest, which was outside the Land Forces Weapons Expo a few months back, where it's not dissimilar to what you're describing, with lines of police with shields firing rubber bullets at protesters and things like that. I think the scale is probably the quite a bit different. There wasn't 10,000 police deployed in that situation, but we're starting to see where the police start to ramp up their kind of repression here as well. So it's interesting to think about the kind of comparisons in two very kind of different political situations. I guess I wanted to go to you recently interviewed an activist who's part of the Emancipa Popular Education Movement. His name was Nicholas Calabrese, and he's involved in this kind of grassroots efforts in Brazil to help make education more accessible to working class people. So I guess just if you could briefly summarize what you learned about that campaign from Nicholas.
Yeah, so that was a really really good interview. I learned a lot from Nico. He's been part of Emancipa for quite many years now, and he's now a coordinator in the Rio de Janeiro area. And yeah, so basically, Emancipa was set up to basically help students to prepare for university entrance exams, specifically in Sao Paulo. And because basically the public university system in Brazil is free, but it has this sort of standardized entrance exam, which is very complex, very difficult, and especially if you went to public school, which the majority of Brazil, like poor, indigenous, black students go to, then they're often not well prepared from these public schools to be able to, I guess, do well enough in the test to get into university. And obviously, there's all these structural barriers as well, for remote and regional areas. Whereas compared to private schools, they have a big focus on preparing. I guess it's a similar thing to maybe the Australian education system, where you would say a lot of private schools have the resources to prepare students specifically for getting into university, and because a lot of the time their reputations are based off how well performing their students are, how many of them get into university and whatever. It's very focused on that. So yeah, it started off as trying to prepare kids for these exams, but it's also the whole program or movement is essentially based off a wider philosophy of education as liberation and as a way to, I guess, politicize and radicalize, younger generations of students. And they have this quite egalitarian approach to how they teach. Nico was telling me that it's very much against, I guess, the conventional way of teaching of a bunch of students just sitting in a classroom. Teacher stands up the front, tells them what to do, tells them this is what you need to know, but with a very, very big lack of, I guess, critical, developing like critical thinking skills or analysis. So they sort of challenge that by having these, they call them circles, where they'll discuss things like, what's being discussed on social media, on TV, in the public discourse, and having these sort of debates between students where everyone gets a chance to speak, put forward their opinion, and that's respected. And I guess practicing this ability to sort of put forward your own opinions and your own debate and sort of back that up, and then as listen to other people's opinion. And as part of these debates, they bring in a sort of political perspective, and I guess not in a dogmatic way of this is what you should think if you want to be part of a social movement, but basically, I guess politicizing these students to, I guess, realize the structural injustices that they're facing, and they do work like going to juvenile detention centers essentially, and helping them sort of attain an education which can then serve them when they're eventually released from the prison, where they face these really horrific conditions, essentially at the hands of the officers and I guess the institutional care or lack of that's provided to them. And so this is for high school students, but they also have like a primary school programs and stuff like sports programs in sort of peripheral areas where a lot of the time the resources are concentrated in the big cities, but they try and go to these I guess more remote areas or even like the outskirts of cities, the sort of working class suburbs, and try and implement sports programs as well as these education programs. And I guess it was really inspiring to hear about some of the work they do, and then I guess how they've managed to sort of keep this movement going, because it's all based off the work of volunteers. And so they actually rely a lot on their students when they go through the Emancipa program, go into university and study and get a degree. They then come back and be part of this movement, come back as organizers or educators, and essentially sort of keep this all going, because it's obviously a lot of work to design these curriculums and these programs where they not only have to cover all of the required subjects, like maths and English and whatever that's required specifically for the exam, which would be a lot easier just to focus on that. But they're not just focusing on what's required to get into university, they're also focusing on organizing in the streets, sort of defending any attacks to education, as well as sort of continuing this ongoing struggle to fight for more democratic access to education, which is obviously a lot of work. It's sort of teaching, but also agitating and organizing and struggling, which takes a lot of hours and obviously relies on volunteers. And so he was saying that now they've got they're up to a third generation of students. So as in kids, their kids have like come back and a part of this movement for fighting for education, and initially started in Sao Paulo, but now it's spread. They've got centers or programs in all over Brazil, in all of their regions. I think he said in 10 different states, they've got about 50 different sort of initiatives going on, which is pretty incredible when you think about that. That's all volunteers. And another interesting point that he said is this is a really important focal ground for, I guess, trying to combat some of the I guess right wing and far right ideologies and thinking that can often filter into particularly under Bolsonaro, I guess centering or a lot of emphasis being put on this far right discourse that he would put forward, that these programs, these education programs, are a sort of really important area to, I guess, push back against that and critically analyze the false promises of of this far right populist discourse. We can fix everything because migrants or women's or indigenous people's fault. So attacks on them essentially going to solve the problem, which obviously we can see that some people I guess are drawn to that, or not necessarily everyone that votes for a fascist or a far right figure is fascist. Obviously that's not the case at all, but people can be drawn into believing these promises that these, I guess, populist far right figures offer. So yeah, he said these program is a way of, I guess, combating that. And then now under Lula, which I guess obviously is a more progressive government compared to Bolsonaro, but he said it's a sort of different level of I guess a threat in a different form that they face, that the Lula government often tries to co-opt a lot of these social movements. I guess in the same way you can draw the comparison to maybe when there's a Labour government, they will try and, I guess, demobilize the unions, say, oh, hey, we're the party of the working class, no need to go and strike anymore, type thing. And obviously Labour controls a lot of the union bureaucracy as well. So yeah, he was talking about that pressure as well of not being subsumed within, I guess, party bureaucracy. And he says there's a lot of pressure that a lot of other movements are facing, essentially, not being essentially being dissuaded from being too critical or speaking out against the Lula government, because then it's seen as essentially maybe allowing space for, if you're too critical of the government, then you're going to let someone like Bolsonaro get back in, type thing. And then you've also got the figures within government saying oh, hey, we're the party of the we're the workers' party, we're the party of the working class. So let us, represent you, type thing. And so, yeah, that's another thing, sort of resisting, maintaining their independence, struggle, and resistance to, the continued attacks on education, and not, I guess, getting co-opted or subsumed into this broad coalition government, that isn't just sort of left-wing sectors, but also has sectors from, the liberals and, from the right even. So that was a really good chat to have. And I think a really important struggle that, we have a lot to learn from. I think Australia particularly has a very unequal education system. Obviously the university and system and stuff is different, but access to education is, you couldn't say it's democratic in Australia at all. And when you look at, for example, how much funding private schools get, which is supposedly meant to be self-funded, it's well, how's that a democratic education system?
Yeah, 100%. And those dynamics you were talking about with Lula and Bolsonaro, if we could definitely see playing out here with, the Labour Party and, the fear mongering of oh, well, if you criticise us, Dutton's going to get in and he's going to be way worse. And we've also seen the dangers of being so connected to Labour with the recent attacks on the CFMEU over here as well. But it sounds like a really inspiring campaign to, especially, it was really good people can read the full interview that you did on the Green Left website. And yeah, obviously education is super important in a whole bunch of ways. But obviously, yeah, as you were saying, here in Australia and in a lot of countries around the world, there's this kind of neoliberalism imposed version of education where, you know, it's all about you know, getting you into the into work and training you for specific jobs, rather than kind of education as a broader, you know, development of a person. And I think what you were talking about before, how this program is linking, it's obviously helping people get into, you know, the formal education, but it's also linking education with, you know, your position in society as a, you know, as a working class person, and connecting education with, you know, how you can engage in struggle and engage in grassroots kind of activism and politics and stuff. And to hear that, you know, people are going through the system, getting the benefits out of it, and then coming back and giving back and as volunteers and things like that is really great to hear. So it sounds like a really cool and inspiring campaign. I guess while we're kind of on the topic of Brazil, this is a slight divergence, but there's these huge fires that have been going on, particularly in the Amazon, and also across other countries in Latin America, as well as, you know, there's been floods and other climate disasters. And I know you've been following quite closely some of the kind of climate developments, particularly with the COP29 United Nations Climate Conference, which you wrote was full of false solutions and empty promises. So I guess combining those two kind of sides, what kind of came out of this COP meeting? And on the other side, what are kind of activists on the ground in Latin America doing to, you know, prepare for these kind of catastrophes or respond to, you know, these massive floods and fires and storms and all these other things that are impacting people?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I guess if people haven't been following the most recent COP, I guess it was, you know, one of the big discussions or debates going into it was supposed to be around what was around climate finance. These demands from, you know, the most climate vulnerable, the most climate affected, and the, you know, the poorest countries in the world, and their demands around getting proper climate finance to pay for adaptation or mitigation and adaptation to the climate-related events that are already happening. So that's what they were bringing to the COP, and well, essentially got refused by the you know, the rich parties at the conference. The demand was to have it was about 1.3 US trillion dollars a year for climate finance. But essentially, by the end, the rich countries only agreed to provide 300 billion, and then the rest sort of just vaguely leaving it up to the market or private interests. And I mean, I guess it's no surprise. I guess the COPs have come to be marked by basically the huge presence of fossil fuel interests. At this COP, there was about 1,700 representatives, like fossil fuel lobbyists, were given access to the COP, which is actually more than the delegate. It basically outnumbered every single country delegation, or nearly every single country delegation, and all of the combined delegates from the 10 most climate vulnerable countries. And, you know, the presidency of the COP, which was from Azerbaijan, which is, you know, a huge fossil fuel exporter, they from the get-go basically did all they could to undermine any sort of good faith negotiations. You know, a lot of the rich countries brought along, as part of their country delegations, they brought along fossil fuel representatives. So, I mean, it's no surprise that coming out of it, there basically wasn't really, you know, as you said, false solutions and empty promises. Basically, one of the big false solutions you'd say that came out of it was carbon trading or carbon markets, which, you know, already exist. Basically, right at the end of the COP, they sort of squeezed through this agreement that basically expands the carbon markets, which is essentially this global system of trading of carbon credits, which you can get carbon credits from things like planting trees and building renewable energy projects and I guess protecting carbon sinks, so like forest stuff. But for decades, it's basically been denounced as a massive scam because it's led to huge land grabs. Of companies coming in and kicking indigenous people, local communities off their land, being like, okay, this is now a carbon sink. And then these credits are then essentially sold to big polluters who, on a spreadsheet, say that they have reduced their, net or total emissions. When in reality, it basically just allows polluters to keep polluting, even though they've technically reduced their emissions. And so, yeah, I guess back to the climate finance aspect of which is, $1.3 trillion obviously sounds like a lot of money, but when you look at that's such a tiny fraction of the richest country economies, and that if there's all these studies that have been done, basically saying that if you are essentially finished with government like state subsidies to fossil fuels, you've actually properly taxed rich people, redistributed all the public spending that goes on military, then you could easily raise. I think the number was $5.3 trillion each year in climate financing, just from things like taxing fossil fuel companies, taxing billionaires, cutting military spending, which it makes 1.3 really seem like a drop in the ocean. All these rich countries, they basically just drag their feet at every turn, and so yeah, I guess the outcome of the COP was that all of these poor countries that were making demands of proper climate financing, as well as rich countries to cut their emissions because they're historically and currently the most responsible for the fossil fuel, for the greenhouse gas emissions that are already causing these huge impacts. They were basically ignored, and we're already seeing all over the world in most climate vulnerable countries these huge climate events. So yeah, as you mentioned, I interviewed an MP in Rio Grande do Sul, which is the southernmost state of Brazil, that basically this year has had these huge flooding events, which basically affected most of the state, particularly in Porto Alegre, which is the capital there. Their airport was basically underwater more than a month, caused huge, a couple hundred deaths, millions of people were affected, and this is basically an unprecedented flooding event, completely fueled by climate change, and so this is already playing, and also a result of government mismanagement. The governor of the state is quite right wing guy, Leite, I think his name is. But yeah, he essentially had been warned for years and years by all of these environmental scientists, environmental managers, basically saying like, look, this area is really vulnerable to flooding, and it's only going to get worse. You need to do something about it, otherwise it's going to be a huge catastrophe. He basically ignored that. He's a proponent of minimal state intervention in anything. And so then when flooding did come, it was an absolute catastrophe, and obviously impacts working class, poorer communities the most. And there were protests after that, or mobilizations in the area and across Brazil, essentially against the government mismanagement, and callous, I guess, disregard for people's lives. And they're still feeling the effects of that, like even months and months later, like rebuilding, relocating people, there's so many long-term impacts beyond just the immediate floods. And so, yeah, in Brazil, that's a huge problem. And then they've also are facing in the Amazon region, facing huge bushfires in the Amazon basin, which wasn't just Brazil was the most affected in terms of land area, but there's also been bushfires across Peru, Bolivia is really badly affected, Colombia, parts of Ecuador as well, and some parts of the Amazon, these are parts that have never burnt before, and it sort of sets off this almost irreversible desertification process where the Amazon dries out and then is more susceptible to burning, which then means the fire can spread to new unburnt areas, and then that area dries out. And because so many parts of the Amazon are controlled by these huge, particularly agribusiness interests, who will clear lots of land for cropping, essentially, for a lot of cattle raising, or growing crops like soybean, which is also used to feed cattle. So there's like this double impact of the land that's used for rearing cattle, but then all of the land that's cleared and used for monocultures to feed the cattle. So it's this hugely, environmentally, ecologically destructive process. There's also a big problem, particularly in Peru, with illegal mining, which the government sort of implicitly allows by not really taking action or listening to a lot of the indigenous communities that are very impacted by illegal mining companies entering areas of the Amazon, clearing land, burning land, because that's what I didn't say is a very common method of clearing land in the Amazon is just burning it, which often can become out of control and burns areas that even people that set the fires didn't mean to. Not that they really care that much. But yeah, and then so in the Amazon you've got the impacts of these fires that a lot of them were started by these sort of mining interests or agricultural interests, then spread. But then you've also got, I guess, the contaminations left behind with things like the runoff from these agricultural areas, or the contamination, particularly mercury from mining. And so, yeah, I guess that's a bit of the picture of the current the bushfire crisis that's going on, still going on in the Amazon region. And I can't speak much to Brazil, but in Peru, there was definitely some protests of people coming, all the way from these inland, highland, and Amazon regions, so crossing the width of the country to get to Lima to protest against the government, which again has been passing laws that basically weaken environmental protections, essentially giving a sort of tacit green light to these illegal logging, illegal mining companies to essentially keep doing what they're doing, because they know that even though technically there's some laws in place that protect these areas, in practice they rarely get fined for it, they rarely get sanctioned for it. So they essentially know that they can get away with it, because for the people that they're affecting, for the communities that they're impacting, they have very little rights to essentially complain or I guess seek reparation or justice for their communities being severely impacted. And yeah, also in Ecuador, that was one of the big demands of the protest, or focal point of the protest I was talking about before, is there was a very big anti-mining, anti-logging sort of sentiment of defending their territories, which in some territories where these agribusiness interests are sort of trying to enter, like some of these places are the sources of towns and cities' entire water supply, and drinking water supply. So if that gets contaminated, you've essentially destroyed an entire city's access to clean water. But yeah, I'm sure also in Brazil there's been some big protests. Maybe I've missed, particularly after the floods and particularly with the bushfires. And I guess people are always going to continue defending their territory and demand that the government, respect their sovereignty and their right to clean water, to clean air, to clean soil.
So these are such huge battles, like life or death situations in a lot of cases, and obviously on such a massive scale. Climate emergency will impact people all around the world. So it's interesting to hear about what kind of campaigns and things are going on. I guess to start to wrap up, there's probably so many different things we could talk about from your time over there, and you're going to be over there for until towards the end of next year, so we'll have a lot more to report back on. We can do another catch up like this, but I guess to conclude, what are your kind of like main takeaways from your time and from talking to the activists that you've talked to over there? And I guess some of the what are the major kind of differences with activism and politics here in Australia? Obviously very different context, so I guess what are your key takeaways there?
Yeah, it's a big one. But I think, I guess biggest takeaway is how I think how inspiring it has been to meet so many really, I guess, radical, staunch activists that are involved in all these really really diverse campaigns. I think in Brazil, I had a really good chance to meet a lot of people from MES, which is the radical tendency within sort of radical revolutionary tendency within PSOL, which is the biggest left-wing party, political party in Brazil. And so they're really really organized, all across the country, super radical, super planted in their communities as well. But then also organize at a national level to, they were obviously very active against the Bolsonaro government, but are still very active in agitating, trying to push the Lula government leftwards and, resisting attacks on workers' rights, students' rights, indigenous groups across the country. And, I think there's examples of this all across Latin America. I think, especially living in countries like Australia or, Western countries, you don't hear a lot about the grassroots movements in countries, especially like Latin America. A lot of what comes out is maybe built sort of mainstream media, which isn't really ever going to place much emphasis on the grassroots. I think that was I guess a really cool part of, or has been a really cool part of traveling around and meeting these people involved in specific campaigns that I had never heard about. For example, in Argentina, I interviewed someone from a campaign called Get Out Mekorot, which is Mekorot is the Israeli National Water Agency. They control basically all of the water resources in Israel and occupied Palestinian territories, so in the West Bank and Gaza. And so they're basically responsible for this system of water apartheid, where Israeli settlements, legal settlements, and Jewish communities essentially get access to, so much water, as much water as they want or need. And then you've got these, Palestinian communities that basically are, some of the lowest water usage rates, way below what's recommended as a minimum daily water usage by the World Health Organization. And so, that's the system in Palestine. But basically, Mekorot has expanded its industries, or its operations all over the world, and are trying to currently enter into Argentina. And so I was chatting to this comrade about their sort of grassroots struggle to resist the entrance of Mekorot into managing Argentina's water resources, which at the moment in Argentina, it's they have free drinking water, basically everywhere in the country, which is quite rare for Latin America. But what is happening is increasingly governments have signed agreements with Mekorot to manage these water resources, which essentially represents the privatization of what's a public resource and obviously a human right as well. And so they're resisting that from that perspective of resisting privatization, but also as standing in solidarity with Palestinians that are living under this system of apartheid. And that was a campaign that I feel like I would never found out about without traveling here and meeting people. And there's examples of that all over the continent. And I think it's important that they get publicized, they get reported on, particularly to faraway places like Australia. And there's a lot to learn. I think we were talking a little bit about police brutality before, where maybe in Australia there's not the same scale of violence, but obviously police still serve the same purpose, the same function all over the world, which is to protect the interests of the capitalist class. So and we've seen more recently that police are more and more likely now to, in Australia, resort to this violence, particularly as protests become more and more criminalised, especially in New South Wales. You've got these draconian anti-protest laws where you can go to prison for 2 years or get fined $20,000 for blocking a public road, blocking public infrastructure. And yeah, I mean, in Latin America, I think that scale of violence has been faced for a long time, for environmental activists, for land defenders, and despite this violence they've been facing, particularly environmental activists in places like Colombia, where they're killed not only by police, but I guess state interests, but they're often killed a lot by mining companies, for defending their land. So I think another thing that is really inspiring and sort of highlights the importance of standing in solidarity with these land defenders all over the world, despite all this brutality that they're facing, they're still taking to the streets, demanding change, defending their territories, fighting for the next generation to have access to the basic human rights: clean water, clean air, clean soil, access to healthcare, shelter. I think with next year, there's a anti-fascist conference coming up in Brazil, which I'm hoping to get to as representative of Green Left. And this is sort of happening in the context of, even though Bolsonaro was voted out, he's still very much a presence in Brazil. He has, a sort of small but vocal and willing to resort to violence group of supporters. And in their local elections, the far right actually made quite a lot of advances in a lot of key areas. So there's still this definite advance and presence of the far right in Brazil. And we're obviously now seeing the election of Trump, but actually that has huge ramifications for, not just the working class in the US, but all over the world, particularly Latin America, where the US has historically treated Latin America as their backyard, essentially a fertile ground for capitalist interest to enter and exploit the country. So, and I guess Trump represents this far right ideology that's definitely taking hold in certain places across the world. This conference I think is coming at a very key time. It was actually supposed to be this year in Porto Alegre in Brazil, but got postponed by a year because of flooding. That'll be happening, which I think is also that's going to bring together activists from not just Latin America, but Europe, which essentially, having this broad discussion of how as the left internationally, we can organize, not just within our countries, within our territories, but, across borders to basically combat the advance of far right, which is obviously a super critical discussion to be having, because I think the left has lost a lot of ground in some key areas, that we need to have discussions about how we can, I guess, regain that territory that we've lost, and continue building the left in a coherent, in a mass organizational way that has the power to take on the far right, as well as the traditional right.
Yeah, it's great to hear about. There's all these struggles going on around the world that are, obviously very different context, very different campaigns and things going on, but they're all very interconnected, and we all obviously live in this, globalized world now where there's these, Australian mining companies that are doing things in Ecuador, and the Israeli water companies, and there's so much to hear about how people all around the world are resisting, capitalism and the effects that it has on all the things that you've mentioned. So it's really valuable having you as a kind of conduit for Green Left to hear about some of these campaigns going on in Latin America that we wouldn't have heard about otherwise, or it would be hard to find kind of the detailed information of. So it's been, really great for Green Left to have your coverage, and I highly recommend anyone who's listened to this and wants to hear more about any of these stories that we've kind of briefly summarized today, and plus a whole lot more. You can head to Green Left and you search up Ben Radford, and you can find all his articles from the past year or so, and all that he's written about Latin America, and also climate crisis and other topics. And also there's going to be a lot more coming in the new year, so keep your eye out for that. But yeah, it's been great to chat, Ben, and we'll definitely have you back on again soon. But yeah, I hope you have a great New Year and holiday period, and get a bit of a rest as well.
Thanks, Isaac. You too.